My interest in Tudor history was sparked by a wonderful tutor. When I went to university, I already knew that I wanted to study history, but it was Dr. Susan Brigden, who was my tutor at Lincoln College, who really made me think that it was Tudor history, or at least the 16th century, that would capture my interest. And I certainly toyed with a few other things whilst I was at university, but in the end, the 16th century won my heart. 1536 was, I think, a crucial year in changing Henry from that young, good-looking and kind prince, he was known for being charismatic and generous and good-hearted, into the tyrant we all love to hate, the savage, capricious, ruthless king he later becomes. And I think it does this because of a number of losses and a number of threats and betrayals against Henry that come as blow by blow, one after another in this year. And of course the death of Catherine of Aragon, and to a much greater extent the death of Anne Boleyn, are parts of this, but it's also what they signify that matters. So it's the loss of an heir when Anne miscarries in January. It's the loss of his honour when she is alleged to have committed adultery against him, and of course the loss of his life. It's the loss of his illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, who's 17 and has been brought up probably in the royal nursery very close to the king. He dies in 1536. And it's also a story of betrayal. So Henry feels betrayed by Anne when she allegedly commits adultery. He feels betrayed by the rebels who rise up against him, 50,000 of them, a vast number at the end of 1536, who contest his religious policies, particularly the dissolution of the monasteries and his assumption of the title of Supreme Head of the Church of England. And of course it's a story of pain, because this is the year that Henry falls from his horse whilst jousting. And this jousting accident results in an ulcer in his leg, which will give him pain for the rest of his life, which I think changes his temperament in and of itself. And also it's a real blow to his sense of masculinity, or manhood as they called it then, and his sense of honour. And people have suggested that actually maybe he even bruised his cerebral cortex, so like a sort of modern day American footballer who has bashed his head and then sees a change of temperament. Perhaps that affected Henry as well. In other words, I think this year is absolutely crucial in understanding Henry VIII's personality. My favourite Tudor personalities, apart from Henry VIII, I think I'd probably say Catherine Parr. She's my favourite of the six wives, and I think, apart from two splendid biographies by Susan James and Linda Porter recently, has been somewhat overlooked. And she was such a fantastic character, a story of great romantic intrigue and peril and danger. She has 4 husbands. She only loved the last one, as far as we can tell. She, despite having 4 husbands and surviving Henry VIII, which is a great achievement in itself, she goes on to have a child when she's in her mid-30s and then dies soon afterwards as a result. And she also is the first woman in England to write a book of prose in the 16th century. And so she just is a remarkable example, I think. I don't think it's either of those, actually. I do think that Henry ordered the investigation, ordered Cromwell to carry out the investigation into Anne's alleged adultery, and I don't think that it was Cromwell plotting on his own without Henry. I really don't think the evidence sustains that, although I won't go into it in detail here, but I do think that Henry wanted the investigation, and I don't think he wanted it because he was tired of Anne or of her abrasive character or of any of the solutions that have been put forward. I think he did it because he needed to look into whether she was guilty of adultery or not, as was alleged, which was a very serious charge. It was serious because in the 16th century, a woman's adultery was thought to suggest her husband's lack of sexual dominance. We don't necessarily get that at first sight, but we have to get into the gender politics of the day. And actually it's hammered home because in the trial of Anne and George Boleyn, her brother, Lord Rochford, George actually reads out loud his statement that Anne had told him that Henry wasn't skillful in copulating with a woman and had neither vigour nor potency. In other words, Henry is not good in bed, he's impotent. And this is said in front of 2,000 people. So there is this real association with adultery and a man's dishonour. So Henry orders it to be looked into, and I think If we go according to the testimony of Lancelot de Car, the secretary to the French ambassador, in his account from June 1536, according to that one account, Henry orders Cromwell to look into it, but he says to Cromwell that if it turns out not to be true, it will be on pain of death for Cromwell, which alludes to an old principle called lex talionis, whereby someone who accuses somebody of something that turns out not to be true will suffer the consequences or the punishment for the crime themselves. It may not be the case, we've only got one source, but if it is the case, it does explain rather a lot, I think. That's a very interesting question. I do think, actually, that Anne might have been spared if she'd had a living son. Obviously, she wouldn't have given birth in January 1536. She was 3.5 months pregnant. So by May, when, if she had been accused of adultery, if we assume that everything else had carried on the same, she would have been big with child. And I think it's very unlikely that Henry would have been able to turn his attention from the possibility of an heir and order his pregnant wife to be executed, whatever the evidence. I don't think that he would have had it investigated in the same way. So I do think it would have saved her if she hadn't miscarried. My favourite Holbein picture, well, can I mention two? I love the ambassadors. I just think it's such a wonderfully rich picture with that distorted skull at the front of it and all the paraphernalia of Tudor culture and art, music, astronomy sort of behind it, and the little glimpse that you can have of the crucifix behind the curtain. I just think it's a fantastic and really interesting picture. One can think about it for a long time. But I also love the painting of Charles de Saulier, probably less well known, also an ambassador who was painted by Holbein in the year or two before he painted Henry in the full-length picture we all know. And I think it was the basis for the picture that he then painted of Henry, because Saulier is looking straight on into the lens, as it were, and he is staring out at the spectator, and he's got these amazing green eyes and fantastic attire, and it's a really arresting portrait. So those are probably my top two, apart from the one of Henry VIII himself. I was one of the lead curators on the plans to represent the Tudor Palace at Hampton Court to mark the 500th anniversary of Henry VIII's accession in 2009. And so that meant working on a new visitor experience in the Tudor Palace, everything from researching historic documents at one end to putting it very directly before the visitor at the other. So whether it's writing painting labels or being a sort of historical consultant on the films that we pitched there, or doing research on the council chamber. We opened Henry VIII's council chamber to the public for the first time. My role was really wide-ranging and absolutely fascinating, and really gave me an insight into how to communicate history to the public. I'm working on a book provisionally titled The Visitor's Companion to Tudor England, and it's going to be published by Avery in 2012, and it's looking at 50 sites across England where we have surviving Tudor buildings, or we have points of interest, but always something that you can go and see, somewhere where you can really walk in the footsteps of the Tudors, and something that will tell you something of the story of the period. So the idea is that as a whole, it won't just be a gazetteer, although it will be a wonderful gazetteer to go and visit these places, which amazingly no one's done before, but it also will be somewhere that can gather together many of the key stories from the Tudor period. So it's actually building on the work of something like On the Tudor Trail, where you're looking at the sites of Anne Boleyn, but looking at sites associated with all the key characters from the Tudor era. My favourite Tudor location, I'm afraid, has to be Hampton Court. It's just such a splendid Tudor palace. It's so vast and so impressive, and I don't think you can ever get over the glory of the Great Hall, or the wonder of walking through the Tudor kitchens. I love it.